and now today we're doing copper. I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%.
President Trump also slapped 50% tariffs on copper imports, but he exempted refined metals. You can see the huge plunge that had in U.S. traded copper, down 22% in the 2 days, about 20% just yesterday.
What happens when the leader of the world's most powerful country demands what does not belong to him? That chilling question defined global politics in 2025. Donald Trump, newly returned to the White House, turned his gaze northward and issued a stunning ultimatum: he wanted Canada's copper. Trump's framing was blunt yet explosive. He claimed that America had a natural right to Canadian copper because U.S. industries desperately needed it, and he threatened punishing tariffs if Ottawa refused. At first, many dismissed it as another reckless Trump outburst, but within hours, trade officials confirmed his threat. A 25% tariff on Canadian copper exports was under serious consideration. The world reacted instantly. In Ottawa, outrage. In Detroit, panic. Across global markets, disbelief. And suddenly 2 men stood at the heart of a storm: a U.S. president behaving like a rogue strongman and a Canadian prime minister who refused to bow. This battle was about far more than metal. Copper has become one of the most strategic industrial resources on Earth. It powers electric vehicles, connects smartphones, and fuels the green energy revolution. Whoever controls copper controls the future. And instead of working with Canada, America's most trusted neighbor, Trump chose confrontation, treating an ally like an adversary. Markets trembled. Copper prices spiked overnight. Canadian mining firms faced deep uncertainty. And in Detroit, the industrial core of America automakers warned of disaster. If these tariffs go through, Detroit won't survive, the year one industry leader said grimly. But Canada was not silent. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former global banker known for his calm intellect, stood before Parliament and declared that Canada would not be bullied. Trump's demand, he said, was nothing less than an attack on Canadian sovereignty. His words electrified the nation. This wasn't just about copper, it was about dignity, independence, and survival. The world held its breath. Would Carney fold under pressure as so many leaders before had? Or would he draw a line that even Washington could not cross? The clash between Donald Trump and Mark Carney quickly grew into more than a trade dispute. It became a battle of two worldviews. Trump's style was familiar, aggressive, unpredictable, and rooted in brute force. To him, resources were spoils to be seized. His tools, tariffs, threats, and ultimatums. By contrast, Carney understood resources as more than profit. They were levers for building alliances, securing jobs, and shaping a sustainable future. Behind closed doors, Trump's team assumed Canada had no choice. The United States remained Canada's largest trading partner, and Washington's economic muscle had long forced compliance. But they underestimated both Carney's resolve and Canada's quiet preparation. Over the last decade, Ottawa had worked to diversify trade. Deals with Europe and Asia reduced dependence on American markets. Investments in green energy and critical minerals strengthened Canada's independence. Carney saw what Trump did not. Canada had options, and with options came leverage. The drama intensified when Carney addressed Canadians directly on national television. His words carried weight far beyond Ottawa. No nation can surrender its resources under threat. Our copper is Canada's copper, and we will defend our right to decide where it goes. That declaration became a rallying cry. Miners in British Columbia voiced support. Environmental groups praised the stand. Ordinary citizens felt a surge of unity, seeing Trump's demand as an insult to Canadian pride. Trump had expected fear. Instead, he ignited resistance. Around the world, headlines called his move economic blackmail. Analysts warned that Trump's approach risked pushing Canada closer to Europe and China. And in the United States, unease grew. Even Republican lawmakers worried the tariffs could backfire, crippling U.S. industries more than Canada's. But Trump was undeterred. Late-night tweets accused Canada of hoarding copper and hurting American workers. It was the same pattern the world had seen before. Blame others, dodge responsibility, ignite chaos. The difference this time was Mark Carney. Unlike past leaders who scrambled to appease Trump, Carney stood his ground. His defiance reframed the fight. No longer was this about one shipment of copper. It was about whether America's closest neighbor would submit to bullying. The world began to recognize what was at stake: sovereignty, dignity, the rules of partnership between nations. On one side, a U.S. president behaving like a rogue operator. On the other, a Canadian prime minister refusing to bend. And caught between them, millions of workers, industries, and communities whose futures now hung in the balance. Mark Carney's rise to power seemed almost destined for this moment. Before entering politics, he had already carved out a reputation as one of the world's most capable financial minds, serving as governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He had steered nations through crises-balanced monetary policy and earned credibility on the global stage. When Carney entered politics, many saw him as more than a politician. He was a strategist who understood how economies truly function, how policy shaped livelihoods, and how nations could prepare for the future with long-term vision instead of slogans. His election as Liberal Party leader in early 2025 gave Canadians a sense of renewed hope. On March 14, 2025, he was sworn in as Prime Minister, promising a strong, independent, future-ready Canada. But that optimism was short-lived. Just as Carney took office, Donald Trump stormed back into the White House. This time, his America First agenda was harsher than ever. Trump declared that any nation trading with the United States must bend to strict conditions under the USMCA agreement or face heavy tariffs. On August 1st, 2025, the confrontation escalated dramatically. Trump announced sweeping new measures. Any Canadian exports not clearly protected under USMCA rules would be slapped with a crushing 35% tariff. If a product's origin was too complex to verify, it would face the same punishment. The shockwaves were immediate. Canadian industries from autos to energy were thrown into chaos. Washington expanded tariffs to steel, aluminum, lumber, automobiles, and other vital exports. And while official documents didn't single out copper explicitly, the metal was caught in broad categories of industrial resources. Copper, steel, aluminum all suddenly became weapons in a trade war. Trump even tied the tariffs to unrelated issues like the U.S. fentanyl crisis, accusing Canada of failing to control smuggling. Yet official data showed Canada accounted for barely 1% of fentanyl flows. Carney called Trump's claims unjustified, and experts agreed. But the accusations kept coming, adding confusion to an already volatile situation. Ottawa could not remain passive. Canada retaliated with counter-tariffs of its own, targeting U.S. exports, less dependent on Canadian buyers. Duties of around 25% struck back at American steel, aluminum, and auto parts. At the same time, Carney's government began crafting policies to strengthen domestic supply chains and push companies to expand into Europe and Asia. This was not simply about copper anymore. It was about whether Canada could resist being cornered. Trump's tariffs were an economic assault, but Carney was determined to prove that Canada had the strength and the allies to fight back. Carney's government responded with a three-pronged strategy: retaliation, diplomacy, and law. First came counter-tariffs. Ottawa imposed billions in duties on American steel, aluminum, and selected goods like cast-iron computers and sports equipment. These were not symbolic measures. They were carefully chosen to inflict real economic pain. Canada wanted Washington to feel the consequences of its aggression. Second came diplomacy. Carney appealed to international audiences, reminding the world that the U.S. and Canada were deeply interdependent. He highlighted inconsistencies in Washington's arguments, like blaming Canada for fentanyl when its actual share of imports was negligible. Trade experts across the globe echoed Carney's criticism. Trump's claims were exaggerated, his tactics reckless. Third came law. Carney's team argued that many of Trump's tariffs directly violated USMCA rules. Goods that met the agreement's origin requirements were supposed to be exempt. By pointing out these breaches, Carney framed Canada not as a rogue actor, but as a defender of international law. He even lifted certain counter-tariffs when U.S. goods proved USMCA compliant, showing fairness in contrast to Trump's blunt force. Still, the economic pain was undeniable. In Canada, manufacturers and miners began cutting exports to the US, searching for buyers in Europe and Asia, or absorbing crushing new costs. Workers feared layoffs. In America, the damage was also clear. U.S. auto plants that relied on Canadian steel and aluminum warned of slowdowns and job cuts. Detroit, already fragile, trembled. Carney understood that retaliation had limits. Canada could not mirror every American move without harming itself. Higher consumer prices, rising inflation, and weakened competitiveness were real risks. Instead, he chose targeted countermeasures designed to maximize leverage while minimizing domestic fallout. But Canada's internal weaknesses were also exposed. Different provinces struggled with trade barriers between each other, permit shipping rules, regulatory bottlenecks. Carney proposed a One Canadian Economy Act to harmonize internal trade, reduce costs, and strengthen the country from within. It was a reminder that unity at home was as vital as resistance abroad. One key truth also emerged. Despite fiery headlines, no credible evidence confirmed that Trump officially demanded Canada's entire copper supply. What was confirmed were the sweeping tariffs, the threats, and the rhetoric. The exaggerations claims that Trump wanted all Canadian copper were likely political framing. Still, the damage was real. Tariffs hurt industries and rhetoric poisoned trust. For Carney, this was about more than numbers. It was about sovereignty, about proving that Canada would not bow to a foreign president using economic blackmail, and about rallying Canadians to see the fight not as partisan politics, but as a test of national dignity. By late 2025, the trade war was no longer a dispute over tariffs. It had become a test of endurance, trust, and survival. Trump doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 25% to a punishing 50%. For industries that already survived on razor-thin margins, autos, construction, appliances, this was devastating. Each shipment of steel or aluminum carried costs that could erase profits overnight. His rhetoric sharpened, accusing Canada of unfair practices, insisting Canadian resources were destroying American jobs. Experts dismissed much of it as bargaining theater threats dressed up as policy. But businesses on both sides of the border felt the chaos. The Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy reported that demand for critical minerals between the two countries had become unstable. No easy substitutes existed if Canadian resources were priced out of reach. Investment decisions stalled. Canadian miners delayed projects. American manufacturers reconsidered contracts. Uncertainty became the enemy. For every Canadian company hesitant to expand, there was an American factory bracing for shortages, and supply chains, once broken, are hard to rebuild. Even if tariffs were lifted tomorrow, the trust that underpinned decades of trade had already been shaken. Carney tried to balance principle with caution. Canada imposed painful counter-tariffs, but resisted overreaction. His strategy was clear: defend sovereignty, uphold trade law, and maintain international support. Where possible, he sought to show restraint, avoiding measures that would harm Canada more than the U.S. Still, the risk of escalation loomed. If Canada struck harder, restricting critical mineral or energy exports, Trump might retaliate with even broader measures. What began with copper could spiral into agriculture, technology, or consumer goods. A full-blown trade war would leave ordinary people, not politicians, paying the heaviest price. The human cost was already visible. Mining towns across British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, once stable and proud, now faced uncertainty. Families who thought their jobs were secure whispered about layoffs and delayed contracts. For them, this wasn't politics, it was survival. In Detroit, anxiety spread for different reasons. Automakers warned they could not produce affordable electric vehicles without Canadian copper and aluminum. Trump's tariffs meant every new car carried thousands in extra costs. Consumers already burdened by inflation faced higher prices. Companies had two grim options: absorb the losses by cutting jobs or pass the costs on to buyers. Either way, ordinary Americans suffered. Trump framed the crisis as defending U.S. workers. But on both sides of the border, workers were caught in the crossfire, confused, anxious, and angry at leaders who gambled with their livelihoods. As the trade war deepened, its impact stretched far beyond factories and mines. It became a political earthquake. In Canada, Carney's defiance turned him into a symbol of national pride. Even critics who opposed his party on domestic issues rallied behind him now. The idea that a foreign president could dictate how Canada used its own resources struck a nerve. His words, "Our copper is Canada's copper," were repeated in Parliament, in cafes, and in homes across the country. Canadians felt united not just in defense of jobs, but in defense of dignity. In the United States, the story was different. Trump's base applauded his hardline stance, but cracks began to appear. Republican governors from industrial states warned that tariffs were crushing local economies. Unions and business leaders joined forces in rare unity, insisting the policy would backfire. The divide widened between those who cheered Trump's toughness and those who felt betrayed by the mounting costs. Internationally, the consequences were just as stark. Europe and Asia saw opportunity. If the U.S. no longer wanted Canada's copper, they would gladly take it. Brussels quietly opened discussions about new trade deals with Ottawa, while Asian economies racing to expand their renewable energy sectors looked at Canadian minerals as a lifeline. Ironically, Trump's attempt to weaken Canada risked pushing it closer to U.S. competitors. For over a century, the North American partnership had been the backbone of stability. Now Washington's aggression threatened to erode that trust, driving Ottawa toward new alliances. Markets mirrored the turmoil. Copper long, called the metal with a PhD in economics, spiked in price as uncertainty spread. Investors fled vulnerable industries, pulling capital from North American automakers while European and Asian firms gained. The punishment Trump intended for Canada began hitting America itself. And beyond economics, there was the social cost. Ordinary people felt the sting most. Canadians saw Trump's threats as disrespect toward their nation, fueling anger and resolve. Americans, meanwhile, faced rising prices for cars, appliances, and construction materials. They may not have followed every detail of USMCA rules, but they knew when their paychecks didn't stretch as far. Trust was eroding. The partnership between two of the world's closest allies suddenly looked fragile, held hostage to one man's demands. The longer the fight dragged on, the harder it would be to rebuild. And still the world asked, what would Trump target next? If copper today, could it be water timber or energy tomorrow? By the end of 2025, it was clear this conflict was more than a passing skirmish. It was a turning point for North America. Trump showed no signs of retreat. His late-night tirades painted Canada as the villain hoarding copper and hurting American workers. He doubled down, convinced that pressure would eventually break Ottawa. Yet Carney refused to bend. Calm, steady, and deliberate, he drew clear red lines, respect USMCA commitments, uphold fairness, and defend sovereignty. Canada's path forward was not easy. Retaliation carried risks. Restricting exports of critical minerals or energy could give Ottawa leverage, but it could also disrupt global supply chains and anger allies. Escalation always threatened to spiral beyond control. Carney's strategy was to balance toughness with restraint, hit back where it hurt, but avoid self-inflicted wounds. Meanwhile, Canada prepared for the long haul. Trade diversification accelerated. Europe and Asia became stronger partners. Domestic industries received support to weather the storm. Carney's message to Canadians was simple. This is not about being anti-American, but about refusing to be bullied. In mining towns across British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, families felt both fear and pride. Jobs were on the line, but their leader was fighting for them. In Detroit and across America's Rust Belt, fear took a different form. Automakers warned of layoffs, consumers saw prices rising, and governors begged for relief. Trump's gamble risked hurting the very people he claimed to defend. Globally, the message was unmistakable. Canada's refusal to yield signaled that even America's closest neighbor would not accept intimidation as policy. Allies took note, so did rivals. If Trump could not bully Ottawa, could he truly bully anyone? The copper dispute had become symbolic, a test of whether sovereignty still mattered in a world where power often meant coercion. For Carney, it was not just an economic fight, but a moral one. For Trump, it was another stage to prove dominance. And so the question lingers, what happens when Trump's threats collide with Carney's resolve? Will the United States and Canada find a path back to cooperation, or will this trade war harden into a lasting fracture that reshapes global alliances? One truth is already clear. In this fight, there are no easy winners. Only nations forced to choose between fear and principle, between short-term pain and long-term independence. And the outcome will define not just copper or cars, but the very future of North American partnership. So what do you think? Has Trump gone too far in treating allies as enemies? Or will his hardline force new compromises? Share your thoughts below. And if you want to follow how this battle unfolds, subscribe, because the fight for resources, sovereignty, and dignity has only just begun.